Welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast, where we bring you the most interesting and enlightening conversations around movement practice and how you can become the most heroic version of yourself through pursuing movement that's relevant to your nature. This is a podcast that's going to feature some of the top movers in the world, some of the most amazing movement thinkers, and people from fields that are related to movement as far afield as evolutionary theory, strength and conditioning, and everything in between. So if you're interested in movement, please stick around. And if you like our work and want to support it, please consider supporting us on Patreon, because this podcast is completely listener supported. We don't want to take any advertising. We don't want to interrupt your experience of watching the show. So what really helps us get the best thinkers on, have the time to put these together, have the best quality for you guys as far as audio and video, is your support. So please consider supporting us and enjoy the rest of the show. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. Today, our guest once again is John Vervaeke. For those of you guys who've been following the podcast, you know John is our most frequent guest and one of my absolute favorite people, and someone who's had an immense impact on my work. So I reached out to John recently because I saw him being interviewed about the subject of science fiction and how it impacted the meaning crisis. And I'm a huge fan of science and speculative fiction, particularly fantasy fiction. And I was just intrigued to hear John's perspective about it. And I thought it'd be grounds for a conversation between us. Just some stuff I had wanted to talk to him about that, about meaning and how it's revealed through discussing and looking at and reading these works. And I kind of actually thought originally that I was just going to have this conversation privately with John, but I figured we'd record it and see what it came out. And I thought it might be kind of tangential to our main conversation, but I actually found that it created one of the most interesting conversations that we've had, that it really allowed us a lens that we could dive deep into many of the things that we're both deeply concerned about and deeply interested in. So I think that everyone's going to enjoy this conversation, whether they're big speculative fiction fans or not. But if you are, I think you're going to get a lot out of this, especially, and you're going to, get some interesting insight into what we're getting out of reading this type of work, and maybe some recommendations on stuff that you might enjoy. So, without further ado, join me for my conversation with John Vervaeke. Thank you. So, John, welcome once again to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, for me too, Rafe. I always love being here. I love talking with you.
Thank you. So, we've been having a little bit of chat before we turned the camera on, gone through a lot of kind of catching up, but we're talking about the power of narrative. And that's one of the things that I want to talk to you about. So this is a little bit off the sort of beaten path of the conversations we've had, but both of us share an interest in speculative fiction.
Yep,
and
very much.
We haven't had a chance to really dig into that. And I just like talking about it with people. So I figured, hey, let's have a chat about it. And I really enjoy the conversation you had with Damien Walter about the idea that science fiction can function to help us with meaning, but it has to get below the propositional layer.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that would be a really interesting place to start, because obviously that connects with my own work. And I don't know if I've told you this, but kind of my journey into a lot of what I did actually in some ways starts with reading The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So when I was 8 years old, my mom was at a yoga training in California, and my dad drove us from Northwest Washington all the way down to California in a car. And he had a friend of his, and his friend would read The Fellowship of the Ring on the road to entertain my dad, and all the kids would be in the back. And I fell in love with the story. And so I came home and that summer, and my dad wasn't able to read it to me, or wouldn't continue to read it to me, but I had this mentor, or I had this neighbor who kind of took on a mentor relationship with me, and he started reading me The Lord of the Rings every night.
Wow.
And it was really profound for me. And then I was basically tested as if I had made no progress through school up to that point, up through third grade, because of my learning disabilities. And so my mom knew that I was actually reading above grade level at home, but was unable to show it on tests. And so she made the decision to take me out and homeschool me. And my neighbor started taking over some of my homeschooling.
Wow.
And so he read The Lord of the Rings to me as a kind of way to motivate me to start doing stuff. And then we also engaged in lots of rough and tumble play.
Mm,
And that was the thing that motivated me to work hard to overcome my learning disability, because I had dyslexia.
mm, mm.
So I don't remember, I was talking to my wife. I think I've gotten the timeline maybe a little bit compressed over the years, but from the Lord of the Rings, we ended up going into the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Mm, mm.
And then I also read David Eddings and, like a bunch of other speculative fiction. But it was through the Lord of the Rings that I discovered mythology. And so then I went through the Greek myths and then the Norse myths. And then I got interested in my Celtic heritage and got into all the Irish myths.
Right, right.
And that took me into an interest in culture and anthropology. And so by the time I was 13 years old, I was consuming like every anthropology book in the local library. So that was like, a big part of how all this came. Like a lot of the science and philosophy behind what we do physically has been really inflected by this intellectual path that starts with Introduction to the Lord of the Rings.
Mm, mm.
And then when I discovered parkour at 12 years old, like I realized that like I couldn't really be Aragorn, right? Right? Like
Yeah,
there were no orcs out there, there were no
yeah,
dragons out there.
yeah, yeah.
And so when I saw David Bell jumping from building to building, what it felt like to me was as if someone had said like, oh yeah, there are dragons out there. They just don't look like what you read in the story,
Right,
right?
right, right. That's cool.
You look
That's
like this
cool.
confrontation with the self. And so for me, there's this idea of the heroic self, which then, was picked up when I found Jordan Peterson's work and sort of build
Right.
up on that. So that was my history with speculative fiction. I think there's something really deep in how these stories have become so important to us and how they reflect a lot of our history of thinking about meaning.
Yep.
I sent you that quote the other day. If God is dead, fantasy is the graveyard, right? Or
Yeah.
speculative fiction
Yeah.
graveyard.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I just wanted to share that little bit of the story, and then just ask you, like, how has speculative fiction kind of impacted your trajectory and growth into thinking about these things?
Well, like I said to Damien, it was a science fiction book that blew me out of the fundamentalist Christianity that I've been brought up in.
Yeah.
It was it's a classic book by Roger Zelazny, who was part of the next wave, right? Or the new wave, sorry.
Yeah.
And to my mind, one of the best as a writer. He was a wordsmith. It's called Lord of Light. And yeah, it introduced me to mythology. Hindu mythology was the first mythology. And then also to Buddhist philosophy, because he actually takes on the role of the Buddha in one of the roles he plays. And so, and then I very quickly around the same time read The Lord of the Rings, and I read Fifth Business by Robertson Davies, which introduced me to Jung, and then I also read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And so those books I just sort of really opened me up. Pardon me?
How old were you at this time?
So that's about 15 to 19. Those 4 years I'm reading that stuff and consuming a lot of it. And what I mean, Lord of the Rings was very important to me. Hesse was very important because Hesse is he's in therapy with Jung when he's writing Siddhartha. So the Jungian stuff is coming through, but also I'm getting introduced to Vedanta, aspects of Buddhism, and mysticism as as something transformative. Those books are all meaning a lot to me. But the thing about the reason why Lord of Light stuck with me for so long, I've ended up reading it a couple times. Over October, I actually read the last book that Roger Zelazny wrote called Lonesome Night in October. And each chapter is a day of October. And so you read it and it ends on Halloween. And so that was a real treat for me because I didn't know that he'd written this book because he died in 93. And I thought I'd read all the Zelazny. And then I found this book that it was actually his last book he wrote on his own. And that was a real treat for me. But the thing about Zelazny, and this is where it starts to get more philosophical and more conversation, is the interesting thing about it. And this is what, I mean, I think all of science fiction, at least after, the golden age, but all science fiction is trying to do this. But Zelazny made it often explicit in his work, and he made it super explicit in Lord of Light, is it's simultaneously, it's doing this weird thing. It's reaching back into, what let's call it religious mythology, because it's very clear that's what it is in Zelazny, right? But it's trying to reach forward into the scientific worldview. It's got this weird task of trying to somehow revivify mythology and situate it within a scientific worldview. And if you think about it, that's a precursor to my whole project, right? It's a precursor of how do we take these symbols and metaphors and myths and all this meaning-making machinery, and it's enmeshed with ritual and transformation. And how do we put it back into the scientific worldview? So I've tended to, science fiction is broad field, speculative fiction even broader. But that's the genre that I've tended to be really interested in when science fiction writers are trying to do that bridging. Sometimes, of course, they're doing it implicitly. They're taking sort of archetypal figures and they're resituating them in, the modern worldview. And they can be really sophisticated, or they can be really obvious, like the Avengers, right? When Thor is literally Thor and all that sort of stuff, right? Yeah. But in the hands of some of the people, I think of was it Stephen? I can't remember. Is it Stephen Brusk? He wrote To Reign in Hell. He was a sort of a somebody.
I know.
Yeah,
but yeah.
Yeah. That so he redoes the sort of Judeo-Christian creation myth. And like that book is compelling. Every time I pick that book up, I read it like cover to cover. Right. Mm-hmm. So Brust, and I think that's his name. I can't believe I've forgotten it. I apologize if I've spoken his name incorrectly. Roger Zelazny. I'm really interested in figures who are doing that kind of thing. Now, of course, all of the Inklings were doing that. I mean, I've read Tolkien, I've read Lewis, I've read Williams, but they're doing it very implicitly. Barfield is more philosophically explicit. They're all trying to figure out how can we bring myth into the modern age. Now, they all became Christian apologists, and maybe you are becoming one too, but at least a non-theist Christian. But I was interested in somebody who was doing it. I've been interested. Obviously, I like that framework. I read it, but the fact that I was introduced to it by Roger Zelazny, and it was specifically not a Christian framework, but a Hindu Buddhist one, and it was something that was taking me out of Christianity, has made me like, I want something more than what I saw in Lewis and in Barfield and in Williams and in Tolkien. Did that make sense? The point I'm trying to make?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think we can. You seem to be interested at the intersection of fantasy and science fiction, right?
Well, yeah, fantasy and science fiction. That's where Zelazny liked to write it. The thing about Lord of Light is it's a brilliant piece of work for that. You can read it, and you can read it consistently as a science fiction novel, and you can read it consistently as a fantasy novel. It's like, and you can't. And it reminds me of Plotinus, the way the spiritual exercise and the argumentation are inseparable from each other. But if you'll allow, I agree with what you said, but what I'm saying, why I'm bringing that out is, if you allow fantasy to mean something more than just entertainment, just, counterfactual universes where people play around. For me, it's got to be something. I mean, I've been deeply impressed. I think I mentioned it with Damien, by Tolkien's recovery theory, that the point of all this fiction is to recover the world we're in, not to escape to another world that we can actually never live in.
Yeah. So, in some sense, I think when I say fantasy versus science fiction, the way I'm looking at that is that you can look at fantasy fiction as, in some sense, looking back towards mythology and towards a pre-modern worldview. And you can still look at science fiction as to say it's going forward. But then there's these places where there's an intentional sort of explicit sort of melding of the two, where you're challenged to sort of see the two things together. Yeah. I'm reading a novel right now by Larry Correa called the House of Assassins, and it's very clearly like it's a fantasy novel with a science fiction structure underneath it, and it's a good novel. It's not one of the more profound ones, but I think a more profound version is the novel that I brought up with you before, which is R. Scott Baker's Second Apocalypse series, who I mentioned at the beginning of this. And he's also a philosophy, all but PhD from Ontario. So, kind of in your backyard.
Yeah. And I've read some of them. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, he sets his world in a it's kind of like a Bronze Age, more like Persian, kind of Mediterranean type world. But at the same time, there's a very intentional conflict with like essentially an alien race that represent modernity.
Yeah.
Right. And so you have people who are magicians, right, who use magic, and then you have people who use techne, which is technology.
Yeah.
And then you have these weird places where they conflict and interact.
Yeah.
And he's very, very intentionally playing with the idea of meaning. And one of the things he talks about is that he's essentially taking the Tolkienian idea and sort of inverting it, right? And I'm more compelled by Tolkien's moral vision and ethical vision, but I think it's very interesting what Baker is trying to do, because he's saying essentially that that we are dislocated, because of the meaning crisis, basically. I mean, that's words, but essentially that's what he's talking about. We have this sense of dislocation from a world where meaning is explicit in the world, that the meaning of things is foundational rather than sort of relative, and we can just decide what we want. And that we had this world in some sense before the Enlightenment, and we still miss it. But what he's sort of trying to do with that series is to show that world is actually horrifying. That's a world where you can believe at the most fundamental level of being that men are superior to women, right? And that can be structural to the way that everyone in society thinks, or that snakes are sacred and pigs are profane, and that this type of thing actually is that our longing for that can be misleading in a way.
Yeah, very much. And that was the point that. Go ahead.
Sorry,
I was just going to say. No, you go ahead.
He's trying to confront us with the fact that the thing that we're looking to go back to has a lot of terrifying things within it.
Yeah.
But also he confronts us with where we're going is horrifying as well. So he confronts this idea of modernity where meaning is completely gone, as also horrifying. So that kind of fits right in that like, how do we ask these questions? So go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that idea about being caught between them. I like that idea. I mean, like I said, I think there's a reason why, like I said, I think it's consonant with the reason why Zelazny really spoke to me, because there's a sense in which the book is doing that too, because the Lord of Light, it's basically a world in which people have used technology, but also personal transformation, and some of them have set themselves up as the god of the Hindu pantheon.
Mm-hmm.
And then what Zelazny captures is the ambivalence towards that, because it's the world of myth restored, and so there's a part of us that longs for that, but then the main character Sam is basically leading a rebellion against the gods, but he doesn't do as much for the second point. He doesn't show as much the horror of the scientific world, but he shows like that there were reasons why we left that world. Carl Sagan's demon-haunted world, right? We left the demon-haunted world because it was haunted with demons, right? Like, and that's a really rough place to live. It often explains why certain religions will sweep an area, right? It's because I was talking to a guy at a conference, and he talked about this huge area of Africa in which Christianity just swept through it. And you're thinking, really, why? And he said it swept through it because with one God and Christ, you get rid of all the demons. You exorcise the demon haunted world is removed, and it's replaced with a world that's ultimately intelligible, redeemable, that has a history. And that people like, that's very liberating for them. And so, yeah, we talk about, and neo-paganism is a big thing right now, and neo-shamanism, and people talk about that, but we forget. And that's part of my criticism of romanticism, as you know, we forget the horrors, right? We forget the demon haunted world. I like the fact that you've also got that the world of Techne, and I'm reading Campaign right now, Techne and Magic. And that world, right? That world is also, well, that's the world of nihilism and the meaning crisis. And so for me, I mean, the literature resonates with me because that's the Scylla and Charybdis that I'm trying to steer my life between. Oh, these are mythological entities. So here we go. It's totally relevant. So Scylla and Charybdis, I think is it Jason and the Argonauts, or is it Ulysses?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Odysseus. There's the two monsters that he has to sail between. If you go either direction, you fall, you're destroyed. I think it's Odysseus, right? I think.
Yeah, it's one of those Greek sailors.
It's either Jason. I think it's Odysseus, though. And so trying to find a way in which we can do. So my strategy has tried to be, well, can I dig down into the science and dig down into the myth where I can get the science and the myth to talk to each other again? So I've been trying to dig underneath to try and find the common ground laying at the depths. But I think there's value in that literature. Sorry, I'm talking too much, but there's value in that literature in getting people to, I mean, especially that experience both horrors, right? The horror of nostalgia and the horror of utopianism. That's often how I phrase it, right? We have these two horrors that we like. We need a horror to relieve us of nostalgia, and we need a horror to relieve us of utopia. And for all the dystopian literature that's out there right now, we still keep trying to get the utopias. That's another reason why I was really attracted to New Wave, because New Wave was the science fiction that first started to criticize, right, the sort of utopianism and the march of science that was you got in sort of the classic age.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I said earlier, like I would still rank the Lord of the Rings. I didn't say this, but I would rank the Lord of the Rings as the most important fiction, or the most important fantasy speculative novel, right? I think it for me anyways, it has the most compelling moral vision. And I would actually put Harry Potter up there. And I think that Harry Potter is a striking work of Christian apologetics by someone who I don't think realized that they wrote a novel of Christian apologetics.
It's like Steven Spielberg did the greatest allegory of Jesus with E.T. and not realizing he'd done it. It's like, you did face Jesus. No, I didn't. Yeah, you did. You really did.
Yeah. I mean, after I encountered Peterson, I went back and I reread the whole Harry Potter series, and I was like, oh, Harry's Christ. Like, and his death and resurrection, and the fact that the thing that redeems him is the capacity to love. But it's profound because well, sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I don't know, we should come back to this because it's interesting. I think it's very interesting that if we look at, if The Lord of the Rings is the great, sort of landmark work of speculative fiction of the 20th century, it's written by a Christian who is self-acknowledged and he's sort of confronting the modern world and his attachment to Christianity through his fiction. And he creates a Christ figure in Frodo, and that Christ figure fails, right? And it is only through providence that the world is saved, right? And then there's like this whole argument for like deontological moral reasoning that's also deep within the Lord of the Rings, which I think is really interesting. We look at Harry. Harry is not Christ because he's not a person who's perfect in his generations, right? Harry's a flawed, angry young man, but he succeeds as Christ succeeded.
Yeah.
Right. In the end, Harry is redeemed because he is able to choose completely the Christ-like path, right? He's able to sacrifice himself without any, completely selflessly for the good of the world, right? Whereas Frodo fails at that, right? And it is only through the mercy that Frodo had shown to Gollum that his failure is redeemed.
But Tolkien's also bringing out another important point, right? Tolkien's,
Yeah.
I mean, Tolkien and Whitehead made this very clear, that the idea that evil is ultimately self-destructive, and that the idea that the redemption of the world and the self-destruction of evil have to be sort of co-determined together. That's what's happening, right? And I mean, they're literally on the precipice together. And it's like very obvious symbolism. It's like, oh yes, I get this. But nevertheless, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's what I find really ironic about the Tolkien thing is the absence of religion from that book. It's very, very interesting. It's very, yeah, because of course there's something like religion in the Narnia Chronicles, because there's Aslan and the following of Aslan, right? But yeah, religion is actually absent. So I wanted to bring up to my mind, the contrast book to Tolkien, because that may spark something between us, right? Because I think there's another great speculative work of fiction, and it's considered that many people consider it the masterpiece of science fiction, and it did a similar thing of reaching back and reaching forward in this, you know, really wonderfully artistic, ambiguous way, and that's Dune. Right, and the thing about Dune, which is interesting, Dune is not written as Christian apologetics, and what he's trying to do, Herbert, right, is he's trying to undermine, right, the heroic narrative, right, specifically, and so he's writing this huge thing, and he's drawing all of this in, and then he's trying to do this huge inversion on it, which I thought was real. I've like. Dune is I'm going to get in trouble. Dune is a brilliant masterpiece, and I've read it a couple of times, but Herbert is not a great writer, right? Right. Zelazny is a great writer, like a gifted writer. Herbert isn't, but the story is just so like, right? The world is the star. So what do you think about that? You've got these two different. They're almost like, to my mind, they're almost like mirror opposites of each other. You've got Tolkien, right? And Tolkien represents, as you said very clearly, I agree with you. There's a Christian apology going there, and there is, you know, the sacred mythology. It's a heroic narrative, right? And then you've got Dune, but religion is absent. And then you got Dune, where religion is like everywhere, like, and people are tripping out in altered states of consciousness all over the place, and like, right? And what he's trying to do is actually subvert the Christ metaphor, and subvert the heroic narrative. So like, it's interesting that we have these two things. To my mind, they should be put in a room and made to talk to each other.
I think that's what Baker does in the Second Apocalypse. Like, the Second Apocalypse series, like, if you look at kind of the beats of the story, the first one is very much like, it's very closely related to Dune, right?
Right.
And then the second series is very closely related to the Lord of the Rings.
Oh.
And I mean, there you can look at the characters and how they represent both, and there are beats that are taken from both stories in both directions. But and he's very explicit about the fact that he's doing this, which is interesting, because like, you talk about the critique of the utopianism or nostalgia of Tolkien, and I think that Tolkien's not that nostalgic, right? He's pointing backwards, but he's not pointing backwards in a utopian fashion. But the desire that he awakens in people then creates a stream of fiction that doesn't have the nuance and the like, the world that Tolkien creates is a tragic world, right? There's a lot of suffering, and Tolkien's experience in the World War I, like, that plays into that world. So, you know, people talk about it as this like binary black and white, like good triumphs over evil type novel, but it's really not at all, right? There's a lot of, like, you know, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the line between good and evil runs down every human heart. Boromir, right, has evil overcome his heart, but ultimately is redeemed. And Frodo, you know, kind of goes through the same journey. Ultimately, he can't resist the journey of the ring. This is not the good guys just triumph, right?
No.
And even, you know, and Tolkien struggled with the orcs, right? Because he created something that was evil, but that was conscious. And but even with the orcs and there's these moments where there's a humanity that shines through in them.
Yeah.
which is lost in a lot of the successor things.
Yes. Yes.
So like there's sometimes I feel like artists often create mimickers who don't understand as deeply what they're coming from.
I think that's inevitable. I think that's inevitable.
But then there's like another generation that comes along that looks back at those and is able to sort of look at where everything that they came from as well and bring something in. So Baker gives us a lot of the story beats, a lot of characters. I mean, Cal Hus is, he has a probability trance that's very much like, and essentially there's the thousandfold thought, which is like the what is it, ability to see the future of the precognition of Paul Atreides. But he knows what he's playing with, and he has a lot of intention about what he's doing and bringing these things together. And then he's also bringing in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and like there are ways in which he uses phrases in the conflicts that happen that are very much like he has this. He says, "Death came swirling down," right? And he'll say that repeatedly, and it has this beat and this rhythm through the battle sections that he uses. And so you can see how it's not from the Odyssey, but he's using the same type of formula.
Yeah.
So you see where that comes from. But what's interesting to me is that I think in many ways, for me, that series is the most sophisticated sort of attempt to grapple with these things. But ultimately, it fails as a moral vision because it points no direction forward. Whereas for me, I feel like when I encountered Peterson and then when I encountered you guys are struggling with the same questions that Baker is struggling with, but you find an answer that actually points towards a way that we can grow and overcome it. Whereas Baker basically, in my opinion, ends up just laying the problem in the most brutal way that you can in front of you. And I think there's something very valuable about that, though.
There is. I mean, great works of art are largely about problem finding, right? And formulating, not about problem solving. So I'll say something provocative then. Does that, you've inspired me. I've read, I think, the first two books so I've got to go back and dig them out and go through them again. I also started reading them when my marriage had ended and I was in a dark place. So I had to stop reading them because it was getting very dark. Yeah, it was like, this is not helping. This is very dark. And so now that there's a lot more light in my life, perhaps I should go back. But here's what I'm going to say that's provocative. And this is, and I know you're going to disagree, but we love each other, and so we're gonna work on it. I mean, I think that what that shows is that there isn't resolution to that problem on the narrative level. It doesn't mean the narrative won't play a role, but I don't think the resolution can be resolved narratively. That's what I think.
I agree with you. This is a conversation that we had kind of off the air. I think maybe we've had a few times, but like you've said in conversations, I think with Jonathan Pajot, that your proposal is that that meaning isn't recovered by recovering our narratives.
That's right.
Recovered dialogue.
By dialogos. Dialogos is more primordial. It's what enlivens narrative and turns it from chronology into drama. And it is post-narrative in that it is that which takes us up into the post-narrative of the mystical experience. And so dialogue and dialogos and dialectic, I think, are more encompassing and therefore are more towards the fundamental grammar of what we need in order to get the transformation. I still stand by that argument. Yes. Yeah.
So then Pajot's sort of counter argument is that, I mean, at the center of what we are is narrative. This isn't precisely Pajot's argument because I don't understand Pajot's argument precisely, right? So there's a little bit of what I think he's trying to say, and also the way that I look at it.
I'll try and supplement that we steal as much as possible.
So some time ago, I was thinking about the self, right? And I was thinking about this idea that we have a narrative self and we have a biological self. And that either can be broken, and if either is broken, that what exists post the break is no longer the self as it was. So if you wake up with total amnesia and everything about your personality is the same, but you do not have the story of who you were up until that moment. Essentially, it's as if an identical twin to your previous self is born at that moment, right? It's not you anymore. And on the same time, you can retain your story, but if you have a major brain change, you're actually a different person. So Phineas Gage had a railroad spike struck through his head, and he's a different person. He remembers who he was, but he's not that person anymore.
Yep.
And so I had this realization, okay, we are the combination of a narrative and a biology. And either of those can have a hard death, like total amnesia or a major brain trauma. But in fact, we're always dying, because our narratives are always being updated and pieces are being lost, pieces are being reframed. And then also our biology, right? Like I don't have the cells that I had 7 years ago.
Yeah, totally.
Right? My gene expression is different. I have gray hairs in my beard. So we are always in a process of dying and being revivified. So I thought that was very interesting. But the reason that I bring that up is because you experience the world as a story, right? You experience yourself through narrative. And so the way that I interpret what Pajot is saying is that at the center of your experience has to be a narrative. And if that narrative isn't well articulated, it doesn't contain all the archetypal elements in some sort of correct proportion, then you're going to have a sense of meaninglessness. You're going to have a sense, and your behavior is probably not going to be good at optimizing itself. And this is, I think, also Peterson's argument and why he places narrative so high. Like, I remember before I met you, I was listening to one of your interviews and you're asking, like, where are the practices in the pragmatic Christianity of Peterson? And, so Pajot is like on one end where he's fully committed to the story. Peterson seems like he's committed to the story without, he's, to me, and this is a frustration that I have, like I listen to Pajot and Stephen Wolford from Rationality Rules. It's like, you can think in a rational materialist frame and you can think in like a phenomenological frame, and you might not, or we don't necessarily have a way to make them perfectly congruent. And the set of claims that are justifiable within those different frames are not the same. And a lot of times what happens is that someone tries to justify a claim here when they're really moved by something over here, or vice versa. And people are just not making it explicit enough. This is where I'm reasoning from. And I think this is kind of what Peterson's trying to do, is trying to say, think about these problems from a rational materialist perspective. Think about these problems from a, pragmatic phenomenological type perspective. I don't know if I have the philosophy perfectly aligned there, but it's something like that. And, but I get the sense that Peterson is softballing what that actually means towards the Christian side of the argument, because he's really saying there's a large spectrum of reality and thinking about reality in which you have to let go of your claims. And I think that that's implicit in his argument, or even inexplicit in his argument. But when he's at Liberty University, he doesn't state it as clearly as he could. But I could be wrong there. I could, maybe I'm projecting my own way of doing that. But with Pajot, I feel like he's saying the phenomenological thing is the fundamental reality that you experience, and therefore it has primacy. And with Peterson, I don't know which one you're actually saying has primacy.
I think that's astute. And given that you are a very strong Peterson sympathist, it's good that I get to talk to you about this, because if I was to just say this, I'll get ganged up on. But I find Jonathan is clear to me that he gives priority to the phenomenological. And I find that ultimately problematic. And I've studied phenomenology very deeply, because phenomenology has problems. And this is why you've got the response of Sparrow, you got the response of Harman, all the people that are into speculative realism, is because it's hard to stop phenomenology from becoming a form of philosophical idealism, where everything is just somehow a mental thing. Like the world has to have non-mental aspects to it. If like to me, that's a bedrock thing. If you want to, and I don't know, like see, well, I'm doing too many things in my head right now, right? Okay, so I'm just worried that I'm being unfair to Jonathan. So I'll try to come back and be fair to him. But right, if you don't have uh, non-mental properties that are real in the sense of causal and effective, you're going to get locked into idealism. And then the problem I have with idealism is there is no good argument that prevents it from becoming solipsism. And then there's no good argument that prevents that from becoming solipsistic skepticism. And that's the hell of the meaning crisis. So for me, phenomenology, and I love phenomenology, it's deeply, deeply important to 4E cognitive science, deeply, deeply. And so I read it deeply and I reflect on it, and and Dan Chappie and I are constantly. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm not just over there pointing a finger. I practice it. Don Idey's experimental phenomenology, but phenomenology has this problem that I just outlined. You need things outside. And what's the discourse we have for trying to get outside the phenomenological, to find the causal things outside the phenomenological that gives the world its real independence and acts as the counterbalance to solipsism and skepticism? It's science. That's what science is as a method, right? And then the problem I have with rationality rules, for me, is, this will sound a little bit harsh, but his science is really inadequate. His science does not include cognitive science. He doesn't get that he does not have a scientific account of how science is generated. He has no ontology of science and rationality. He doesn't say how these things exist or where they exist. He just assumes them as ontological primitives without telling me how in the hell they actually fit into his scientific materialistic worldview. And so I find the purely phenomenological drops into a hole, and the purely rational materialistic drops into a hole, which is very much like what we've been talking about already.
Yeah.
Right?
No, that's awesome. Because so what is being portrayed in the story of what is this kind of thing that is being revealed through science fiction? We have to recover something from a phenomenological sort of worldview centric or experienced worldview centric meaningful place. And yet that somehow has to be congruent with modernization, right? Like even if you talk about Tolkien, right? Tolkien's super anti-modernization, like Mordor is industrialism, right?
Yeah, totally.
And yet there is a sense of meaning that is being lost from his world, right? The arcane elements are slowly leaking away and giving rise to the age of man as the third age ends, right? So there is a sense that Tolkien is pointing towards something has to happen after this, and it has to let go of the elves.
Yeah, right? The magic goes away. I mean, that
magic goes away.
To the Larry Niven book, right? The magic goes away. And that's the Weberian theme about the disenchantment of the world. But here's the thing, and to circle back around to Peterson, like I think narrative only exists in the phenomenological world, and what the scientific world says is no narrative, and the only thing that can bridge between them, right, is actually dialogos. That's my argument.
Okay.
Because narrative, I mean, that it isn't coincidence, and this is where I don't want to feel unfair to Jonathan. I think he is astonishingly brilliant, right? And I want everybody to hear that from me. And and whenever I have discussion,
his insights is what you're like. I would say that we need his insights.
Totally. And I want to be in continual dialogos with him because it is beneficial to be so. That being said, I don't think there's a coincidence that he is deeply attached to narrative and phenomenology, right? Because they are locked like this together. And I think, and I argue in the series, I think narrative is very much important for developing your perspectival knowing so that you attain personhood, right? So for transforming your salience landscaping so that it becomes a moral landscape so that you become a person. I clearly think, And I clearly argue that narrative is important for that. But I don't think that the response to the meaning crisis, which is like what we're talking about here, which is, well, what actually bridges between the narrative phenomenological and the non-narrative science, right? Scientific. I think it's dialogos, and because it gives us the connection to distributed cognition that is so central to science, and right, and picking up on all of those aspects of cognition. But it also gives us, well, there's the aspect of drama in dialogos, in which people are taking up roles and perspectives and positions that is, well, like I said, it makes narrative possible. And so I see dialogos as giving us access to both, while also allowing us to transcend both, like I said, in the mystical experiences people have of self-transcendence. When you're in the flow state, when you're doing parkour in the woods, you're not in a narrative frame. I mean, you've got a background narrative of your life, but what you're doing there, I mean, that's one of the classic features of flow, right? So I think, but there's something dialogical about when you're doing parkour, right? You're in dialogue with your environment. That the language of dialogue comes naturally, and so I think, for me, that's what I mean when I'm critical of Jordan, because I find it seems to me, I want to be really careful, like he equivocates between these two worlds and just moves between them and remains ambiguous between them.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
Okay, and I don't think ambiguity is the way to resolve it. I think, and I don't think narrative will do it either. I don't think a purely, rationality rules approach will do it either.
It doesn't. Yeah, I mean, so, oh man, we've I feel like we've kind of lit off a bomb where, like, a lot of the things that you and I are talking together are sort of like flying in the wind now, and the table, and so many directions we can go here, which is very interesting to me. But I'm trying to bring it back, because like some of this stuff is really profound, and also like it might have like flown over someone's head, right? Because it just came out really fast. But so in Maps of Meaning, at the beginning of Peterson's book, he says the world can be construed in two ways: as a form for action and as a place of objects.
Mm-hmm.
One of those is the domain of science. The world is a place of objects. The other is the domain of literature, religion, art, narrative.
Yep.
Right. And so he basically makes the case that we have to recover meaning by returning to these sources. Mm-hmm. And as we're talking about science fiction and fantasy, we also see this sort of tension between a science fiction worldview, where we're looking at the world as a place of objects, right? Like, what is hard science fiction about? It's about exploring deeply the technical aspects of a worldview, versus, like really like sort of super fantasy, like objects become almost ephemeral, right? And so and then you have these amazing works like Baker's Zelazny, where they're sort of like forcing us to look, can we bounce between these levels? And you said that with phenomenology, you don't see how it doesn't collapse into idealism, right? Which is the idea that the ideas proceed. And like this conversation that you've had with Peugeot and a few others, where you guys talk about emergence and emanation. And that's I'd like to unpack that language a little bit. But in some sense, like emergence, we can look at as, I believe, if I am understanding correctly, that emergence is the thing that comes up from the material, right? So the material organizes itself into things. And therefore we can see something as emergent. For a hard materialist, you might want to argue that everything is emergent. Consciousness is an emergent function of atoms bouncing around in a certain way. And that's just a random causal loop that goes back to the Big Bang. There's no meaning to it. And what J.P. Marceau and Jonathan Pageau, et cetera, are arguing is that there is this thing above that is being reflected down.
Yep. That's which is a Christianized version of Neoplatonism.
Yeah. Well, so you're like, you've talked about the eidos, right?
Yep.
Right? The structural functional organization of something.
Totally.
And so once a bird exists in some sense, it is both this emergent thing, but it is also this template and a thing that we can understand potentially.
Yeah, I mean, so it's kind of a Neoplatonic Whiteheadian idea. I mean, there has to be real patterns to possibility that regulate how self-organization occurs, so it regularly occurs the way it does, right?
Can I jump in there just really quickly? Because this is something I think is super cool. As an example, did you know that the crab body form has evolved 9 different times independently?
Yep.
Carcinization. So there's some
for
balance.
Blood has evolved independently multiple times.
Eyes have evolved independently multiple times.
Yeah.
And penises.
Yes.
I don't know if you ever heard of the tailed frog, right? Yeah. Or mallards. Mallard ducks have a penis that is, not homologous. It's analogous, right? It's evolved independently. So, anyways, so there are places within that kind of landscape of potential adaptation that have gravity, let's say.
Yeah.
Also, like saber-toothed cats is another really cool example.
Yes. And you can see deeper things even in the inanimate world, like branching structures, right? And like, all kinds of things. And so there's lots of good work on this. So what I'm seeing is, and you even have it at the core of science, and I mean physics, because you have these 2 core theories, and one is an emergence theory, which is quantum, because things are emerging out of pure probability up, and then you have relativity, which is this, it's a cosmic scale thing that is somehow emanating and constraining how everything is unfolding, and the two, and we don't know how to get those two to talk to each other.
So, I mean, that's fascinating, because we can think about like emergence and emanation, right? Or
but can I make my point? Can I jump in here now?
Yes, please do.
For me, and that goes back to Plato, and you see it all the way through, and it comes to fruition. And J.P. Marceau, I was the person to put J.P. Marceau onto, John Scotus Erigena, right? That dialectic is not just a way of thinking. The relationship between emergence and emanation is dialectic, because right, it is a process. You like the, and Jonathan, when I press him, he will, I believe he'll agree with what I say. You shouldn't think of it as emanation from here and it sort of down, and it's more like they completely interpenetrate each other all the way through, right? And that the idea is that this is a dialectical process, yes. And so that it's not just that we are bridging between like domains, like the mythological and the logical when we're doing dialectic. We are actually emulating and participating in the way these 2 fundamental poles of existence are interpenetrating each other. That's what I mean when I say dialectic is way more primordial and profound. And to come back to Peterson, see, Peterson, the way Peterson tries to do it, to my mind, is he brings in Jung, but he makes it grounded like in science by grounding Jung in psychology, but then he invokes Jung, right, with all the mythology. But the thing about Jung is the narrative is in the service of the dialogue. What's ultimately going on in Jung is the dialogue between the conscious mind representing rationality and the unconscious mind representing the mythological. And the mythological throws up all this stuff, right? But it's the dialogue, right? It's the axis mundi is actually, the dialogical aspect is actually the primordial engine in Jungian psychology. We think about the archetypes, but that's not the thing. It's the that's why he calls it the axis mundi. It is the axis of the world, is the dialogue.
So I just want to go back for a second because I mean, there's so much there. But you said, let's say, from a traditional theological or ideal, like idealist perspective, right? The forms precede,
Yes.
right? Right. And what you're saying is, you know, it's wrong to see sort of general relativity at the top and quantum below it, and it's wrong to inverse it. You have to have both sides of these two things.
Interpenetrate all the way through.
So for some reason, what popped up in my mind is when Sam Harris and Peterson were dialoguing about God, someone asked, if humans didn't exist, would God exist?
Mm-hmm.
So that to me is like that idea of like you can't quite get out of the two things and be able to see from a perspective where you can put one above the other in a way. Does that make sense? Do you see where I'm going with that?
I think so. Let me riff on that, because I think the point of that question goes to the heart of what I was saying, because
Yes.
people are ultimately worrying that God is only exists from a perspective of idealism. And that ultimately, if there were no humans and no minds, there wouldn't be a God. I mean, that's the worry I was expressing when I'm saying, if you go phenomenological, right, and then you either say, well, it's all just a projection of my meaning, or you say, no, there isn't anything behind it, right? And it is just, right, all in some mind. And that's where you get the problems with solipsism and skepticism. And I think that's, I mean, I think people, well, maybe like me, but also more like you, that those dangers within what Peterson is saying, I think they need to be really, I think that was a really good question that was asked. And I'm uninterested in Harris's answer, because I think, like, because I don't think
it's an attempt at pure rationality where rationality has already been exhausted, right? And like you said about rationality rules, there's aspects of science that have already moved past this pure rationality.
Totally. And like the invocation of truth without having an ontology that makes, like, where is, like, what do you think truth is? Like, do you like, it's not physical. Like, what do you think, like, what is it you're invoking, right, when you're invoking truth, right?
So this is my frustration with the conversation between Pajot and rationality rules, is that it seemed like they're invoking their own epistemologies and ontologies and aren't being explicit about how those are different, and and whether they can reason within the other person's set of epistemologies and ontologies. And then in particular, I think that rationality rules, Stephen, he makes the mistake of assuming that Pajot's epistemology grounds out in the same way that his does.
Yeah. And the epistemology, the fact that Jonathan ultimately has a Neoplatonic model of God in which God is no thing, like, that was clearly, like, he wasn't ready for that, right? It was like,
that whole new atheist paradigm is built off of taking the most kind of extreme fundamentalist evangelical Christian model of God, and like he says in that like most people think about God in a certain way, but if you look at the poll data I was like, that's not actually true.
No,
right?
It's not true, and it's not true around the world. It's a very ethnocentric thing to say, right? And it's a very Eurocentric, right? Very Eurocentric Enlightenment thing to say, and it's the same thing with Dawkins, I think. But the point I was trying to make is, right, in the way, this is very much a work in progress, and the whole dialectic into dialogos. But I see dialogos as that process in which we are, the deeply Platonic process in which we are genuinely wondering together, and we are moving out, and we are reculturing together, we are recreating together a new possibility for how we can conform to each other and to the world. We are making new cultural cognitive grammars possible. And I think that's the level at which we have to be operating, right? Because like what you saw with rationality rules and Jonathan, like there's nothing going on there. You see, when you debate, which is our Enlightenment model, debate, we realize that when we're just talking, all we're doing is social grooming. But when we don't agree, we are like, oh wait, we can move to this level called debate, and there's where we can come to an agreement, and then we can drop back down and share our lives together. But the problem is, debate presupposes a shared normativity, and if you don't have a shared normativity, like you said, and a shared epistemology, a shared way in which you generate your epistemology and ontology, debate doesn't work. It just right, and so you can't. You have to go to another level. And that's where Chris and I are arguing, Chris Mastropietro and I, that's where we're saying dialectic into dialogos is. That's why you're seeing the emergence of all of these discourse communities in which they're trying to get back to, okay, can we gain access to the communitas machinery, because that's the basis for communication machinery. That's the point I'm making.
Mm-hmm. So
it's interesting. One more thing: the people, the neo-Pagetians who are into post-formal operations. So formal operations, when you can think like a scientist. The way they talk about post-formal operations, they talk about metasystemic reasoning, and they also talk about dialectical reasoning. They talk about this ability to move between entire paradigmatic structures, right, and have this kind of flexibility.
And so this is sort of where I think my critique of Peterson is, and also of this kind of conversation with Pageau and rationality rules sort of also hits the same thing to me, which is, well, I think what he says at the beginning of Maps of Meaning is incredibly profound. You have to be able to construe the world in both ways, right? You have to be able to think across both paradigms, and you have to be able to sort of put them in dialogue. And what I see in that conversation is I'm going to ground here, and I'm going to ground over here, and then I'm going to assume the truthfulness or my ground and try to kind of impose it on your ground, rather than saying I'm actually just grounding in a different place. And because I feel like one could, I would say that within a rational materialist worldview, I've never heard an argument for the existence of God that held any water. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I can also say that a rational materialist worldview results in a recognition that what can be apprehended through that worldview, and this is my critique of the new atheist, right? If you really go all the way with rational materialism, what you get is, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and there's always going to be stuff outside of this that I can't understand, and this can't be all of my worldview. And then you can go over to phenomenology, and you can say, hey, I can make an argument for the existence of God here, and it's great, but and that might change how you operate in the world, and that can be really important, and it can be profound and transformational. But it doesn't allow you to then walk into the rational materialist world as a form for objects, or as a place of things, and start making claims that are incoherent. And that's the thing that I haven't seen. And I think Peterson actually does get very close to this, but then he wavers at the brink, it feels like to me, right? Because he says it, his worldview grounds out in Darwinism, right?
Yeah.
Does it select? That's rational materialism, right? And then he
basically non-teleological.
Yeah, right. And then that's like, okay, well, then there's the pragmatic, the pragmatism that forces you into that. But if you're talking to the guys at Liberty University, et cetera, they're not accepting that ground.
No.
Right. And it feels like sometimes he's not stating it. And this is what I wanted Jonathan to do with rationality rules, or vice versa, just saying like, this is my epistemology. Yeah. And it allows me to think in certain ways. And like Jonathan's a brilliant guy. He can think in a rational material worldview, and he can say, hey, this is what follows logically from this chain of thinking. I just don't prioritize that frame above this frame. And if you're willing to sort of say that, it doesn't solve everything.
No.
But it resets the argument to the point where you're not necessarily talking past each other, is what it feels like can happen.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I think the place where we practice multi-perspectival integration, where we're not trying to win over the other person, but do exactly the kind of thing you say, where you can move between the perspectives and appreciate them, and perhaps even come to see them stereoscopically. Again, that's where I take that. I think I take it that's what Plato's great dream was, to try and create that as a practice where people would be open to that. That's how I interpret him, and that's how others interpret him. And for me, that jives with like the Kyoto School, where the Kyoto, I mean, so the Kyoto School has the advantage, right? And I actually, I have in the hallway, I was talking to Jordan and I was saying, you got to read Nishitani's Religion and Nothingness. You're so concerned with nihilism, and yet you haven't read, to my mind, the greatest book written as the response to nihilism that's ever been written, right? And that's what, you know. And the thing about the Kyoto School and Nishitani is the nihilism of the West doesn't go deep enough, because it ends in nothingness and it can't get to no thingness. And no thingness requires prajna, requires this, right, stereoscopic fusion of these. And the way, and when you said to me, well, I don't know about that. Well, I would say back to you, you know, what if the Buddhists have, you know, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. They do talk, and I think John Scottus Erigena, you know, his theory of creation is, it is, right? You can cut to a place where you see them I'm sort of, I don't want to make an argument from authority, but I think I know what they're talking about, what that looks like. It's simultaneously trans-narrative and trans-argumentative. And that's, you know, that's the core thing I've been trying to get to in all of my work, because I agree with Nishitani that I think that, and the Neoplatonists like Eckhart, right? You know, I pray to God to save me from God, right? Like that weird thing that he's doing there, right? And you know, and Suzuki saw this. He said, you know, the stuff I'm talking about, Eckhart's saying it. Here it is. Like, he gets it. That's that. Sorry, I'm getting too passionate, but that's what that's what I'm trying to get to. I mean, this is after I was done with Awakening from the Mini Crisis, and largely because of criticisms made, good ones that I took to heart, and I mean that, right? Yeah. From Paul and from Jonathan and from you, right? I've been trying, right, to say, well, no, we do, and Jordan Hall too. He's Guy Senstock, all these people, right? And it's like, yes, I'm trying to get to that place where we know how to practice living, right, stereoscopically between these worlds, so that we're no longer fixated in an almost idolatrous fashion on the two of them, and like Burden's ass caught between them. We're actually got that so that we can look through them and beyond them. That's what I'm trying to realize.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was just too.
No, it's, I mean, it's just, there's so much there. It's such a rich topic. The thought that came into my mind is there, right? There's a couple things of Peterson's that have come, that like I've kept wanting to come back to, but
sure.
One of them, you talked about the dialogue, where dialogue is central to you, right? Yeah. And for some reason, I kept going back to in my head this way in which insight is generated, or how knowledge is created in Peterson's model, right? In Peterson's model, we start with exploratory behavior, right? And exploratory behavior then gives way to play. I think it's play is next, right? Because you start repeating things and adding variation to them, right? Or no, it's imitation. Imitation is second, right? So then in play, then there's ritual, drama, literature, et cetera, all those things. And then eventually there's articulated philosophy, and then eventually science, which is really, really new, right?
Yeah.
And then you have your 4 levels of knowledge, right? Propositional, right? Yeah. It's like when we introduce knowledge now semantically and through science, we start at the propositional, but all that knowledge sort of actually was generated from the bottom up.
That's
right.
That's why we need a science that is the science of the missing kinds of knowledge, so that we can rehome science within the scientific worldview. And I take that to be the mission of cognitive science, explicitly.
Yeah. So what I kind of get out of this is like Peugeot and Peterson are talking about narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about dialectic. I'm talking about body practice.
Yeah.
And it feels like we need all of these things, right? We like, you have to, you always will inhabit a narrative. And so having the right kind of narrative it's an inescapable problem. But the narrative itself is insufficient because it's a dogma when it doesn't have dialogue.
I like that way of putting it. That's close
right?
to what I would agree with. Yes.
And then at the same time, I don't think the dialogue is sufficient either, because what is revealed through dialogue, what is revealed through narrative, must be made actionable and must be repeated in action for it to become deeply participatory and perspectival.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I've always argued, and I've been explicit and repeated on this, that dialectic into dialogos is a meta psychotechnology. It always has to be it always has to be homed in and emerging from and returning to an existing ecology of practices. I've been explicit about that from the beginning. So my talking about the primordiality of dialogue, right? Right. And remember, I'm not just talking about interpersonal. I'm also talking about intrapersonal.
Yeah.
Right? So I think of the relationship between the kinds of knowing as a dialogical relation, dialectical relation in a very powerful way, because they're communicating with each other and informing and transforming each other throughout. But as the practice that I'm talking about, I have explicitly said that we should not. In fact, when I'm teaching people, you shouldn't be doing this until you've done all these other practices, movement practices, mindfulness practices, virtue practices, like McClellan does in the Wisdom of Hypatia. Like I taught the Wisdom of Hypatia course. You shouldn't be doing this. No orphan to dialectic. That is a deep and profound mistake. Totally.
Yeah. So if dialogue is essential, that's kind of dualism, isn't it? Right? Because
So no,
well, I'm just playing with this, because in order for if dialogue is primordial, then having two things that interact is primordial.
I don't think that
right?
so saying it's primordial is not to say that it's ultimate, right? Those aren't the same, because I said, I mean, dialogos. Well, sorry, I'm being too harsh. What I'm proposing is that dialogos grounds us in the primordial and it prepares us, right, for the ultimate. Because the point of dialectic is, as I said, you're supposed to see through the opposites towards what they converge. It's supposed to return you to the one. You're supposed to actually be affording, like I said, the mystical ascent, the anagogic ascent to oneness.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I don't have quite the philosophy background you have, obviously. So my understanding of dualism or something may be limited. But whatever reason, what's popping into my head is the beginning of the Tao Te Ching, right?
Yep.
The way that can be named is not the eternal way.
Right.
The nameless is the mother of all things.
Right.
The named gives rise to the 10,000 things.
But they're also one. It says.
So, yes. So there's a one and two there, right? There's the ultimate, and then there is within the ultimate there is potential, and like Peterson would call it chaos and order, right? But you could almost look at it also as emanation and emergence, right?
Totally. And so the point is this: the point is to see the non-duality between the unity of all things in connection and the uniqueness of everything in its specific determination. And there's a oneness because the idea is only the unending determination, all this, all these unique things actually give you some sense of the full, sorry, this is a metaphor, power of the one. But it's also, that's the emanation down to determine to determine specific things, but these specific things are all wanting. They're all self-organizing, and then they're forming self-organizing, and they're all, they're all connecting. And that's also the unity of all things. Like, and we have this idea now, we especially, right, of the unity of the cosmos, because it starts in a singularity and it's entangled and blah, 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 right? And so that's exactly it. And the point about dialogos is to get to that, right? It's to get to, so you read through Plotinus and you read through Damascus, like the point is to realize ultimately that, to realize, not to think, but to realize, like to fully embody, fully in mind, fully embed, fully enact non-duality.
Interesting. And non-duality is realizing the unification, but it almost goes back to, I'm going back to, in my mind, complexity is unification and diverge.
Exactly. But that's exactly it. Notice that complexification is basically a dialogue between integration and differentiation, but it's not happening sequentially like a story. It's happening simultaneously and in parallel. And then what the Neoplatonists say is that is always what's present whenever there's intelligibility. There's always the differentiation and always the integration. And if you follow it both ways, you get to, right, the non-duality, the oneness that is the non-logical identity between the emanation and the emergence. And so for me, dialogue and dialectic is the process of making your mind, right, reach into the primordial dialogue that you emerge from, but through dialectic, prepare you for the non-duality that is the best, to my mind, because you see massive convergence between the East and West, the best way of trying to put us into relationship, right, with what is ultimate, what is most real.
So, so you have divergence and integration, or what was the term?
Differentiation and integration.
Differentiation and integration. So if we go back to the Tao, right?
Yeah.
So the thing that the nameless would be sort of the integration, right? Like it's all the things together.
Right? It's
right?
the circle. It's like when you got the circle of the Tao, right? It's the circle,
yeah.
And it makes the possible.
And the differentiation is the named, right?
Right.
And this is why yeah. So
you have a bit of the white and the black and a bit of the black and the white to tell you that the integration and the differentiation are completely interpenetrating. And the reason why it's curved is that is fluid and ongoing. And only all of that, and you're supposed to look through that to grasp what isn't captured by it, which is that which you only get the negative space of in the circle. The Tao is what you see through it.
So then I have this sense that rational materialism tends to run up into, it gets stuck in differentiation and doesn't get back to unification, right? And this is like, again, I feel like I'm treading water that's above my pay grade here, but
interesting metaphor.
Mixing my metaphors. As a movement teacher, right? The sense that I have is that over the last, the Enlightenment, industrialization, rational materialism, they all sort of, at the very beating heart of what made a lot of this powerful and effective is reductionism. Right?
Yes.
It's the ability to break things down into pieces, take apart the atoms, right? Yeah. And then what we're discovering is that you can't ever understand the whole by just looking at the pieces. Right. And that we have to have some theory of complexity. We have to have some understanding of these dynamical systems and how they operate in order to actually be able to do stuff well. So like when I look at the history of physical culture, I think of the 80s as sort of the apogee of isolationist physical culture. It's just your aerobic system. It's just your capacity.
Right. So they're isolating
just the muscles. It's just the Nautilus machine, right? And then like in the late 90s, really into the aughts, and then up to now, is this point of reintegration of the body. Like CrossFit is the first sort of major sort of rethinking of the body as a generalist thing, and that fitness is the ability of all of these things to work together.
Right.
And, you know, MoveNat and Ida Portal and parkour, like they're all sort of building these things, kind of rehabilitating the idea of the generalist, right? And then of course my own work, I would say, is taking that the furthest, because I'm bringing these things together in a different way, where I'm understanding play and understanding all this stuff.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because it feels like, well, obviously you and I are talking, right?
Yeah.
And we're talking because you are seeing something that is aligned and that connects with what I've seen, right? That the history of the body is somehow reflective of the history of the way that we've thought about the mind, right?
Yeah.
About cognition.
Totally. Yeah.
And that again, these two themes that we've been talking about throughout this, like, how do we look at bottom up and top down?
Yeah.
Right. How do we see those two things in a way that provides us a balanced point that, you know, allows us to see past the horror of an intrinsically meaningful world, right?
Yeah, and
not get stuck in the horror of a intrinsically unmeaningful world.
I think that's well put. One way that might help, and I realize I might be trespassing on your time, is to not to abandon, but to transpose the top down and like into the conversation that I had with Ian McGilchrist into the left and right. Because I mean, we come with these hemispheres, the left that wants to go to the well-defined problem, do the analysis, pursue certainty, and right, because it evolves to deal with well-defined problems, and there's a lot of those, right? But we've got the right hemisphere that has to deal with, you know, predation and unexpected things, and it's wide open and it's connective, and right. And here's the thing, and you know what I'm going to do here. The relationship between them is this weird communication, mutual constraining, mutual opponent processing thing. But what actually happens is insight is not in the left or right hemisphere. It's in shifting between them. It's in shifting between them and constantly moving between them. And so I think when we talk this way about the world, and we can use this vertical metaphor we've been using about top down, bottom up, I think we should also put it into connection with, you know, this horizontal thing in which we are moving between the left and right hemispheres, the ways of paying attention, the ways of orienting, the ways of adopting agency, of adopting role, right? And we can see that, right, there's a way of thinking of this that actually triggers this, that makes us much more insightful. And for me, that's the point. That's the point that I'm trying to get across. Is there a way of thinking about our ontology, what I'm arguing is a dialogical way, that not only gives us a really good account of how to bring these two, the emergence and the eminence together, but it's also going to be provocative of transformative insight, because that's what I actually want. I don't want just to recapitulate, right, an established ontology. I want a dialogue. I want the ontology to be triggering, transform. I want Socrates. I want these discussions about the nature of the world, the nature of virtue, or right, or maybe Plato, right, that are going to lead to transformative insights, right? The internal communication and communing has to completely jive with the external communication and communing. That's what I'm trying to get at. And so I think what you're talking about is, right, I think it's deeply pertinent, because if I don't want, you're giving me an opportunity to, and I'm sorry, I'm standing on a platform, but I'm taking the opportunity you just afforded me to say, this is not ultimately about, you know, what's the right ontology. This is about, right, it's about anagoge. It's about trying to get the right syncing together of the most transformative insights with the most open way, the most access to the intelligibility of the world, because that will make people ultimately flourish. If the inner dialogue and the external, right, if those are most consonant and talking to each other, that's what I care most about.
Can you just real quickly tell us what anagogy means?
Which,
specific.
oh, anagoge. So anagoge is the idea that there's two things I want. Idea of two meta drives. One is, and we have metaphors for this, right? I want inner peace, and I want to be in touch with reality. What inner peace means is the idea is I'm not a single thing. I'm a system of systems, and these systems are often in conflict. They pursue different goals and different strategies, and they're in opponent relationship with each other, because that's actually how you make an adaptive system. So I want to lose weight. My famous, but there's the chocolate cake, and one part of my brain's going, you evolved on the savannah, eat as much glucose as you possibly can right now, right? And then there's another part of me saying, well, I know about health, and we all know this inner conflict, and that's a humorous example. It doesn't bother too many people, but inner conflict. Think of anxiety. We talked about it earlier, right? Between the essential self and that inner conflict can be debilitating and crushing and horrible. And most people, I would argue, have a profound kind of inner conflict between the phenomenological, mythological, and the scientific, right, worldview. So they're riven. And what Plato argued is we want to somehow, and this is Jung is basically the Plato of the psyche. Jung was trying to say what we need to do is properly figure out how to get these to have, and this is Plato's idea, inner justice, how to talk to each other so they can get the best mutual life together as possible. And then the idea behind that is when you do that, right, it basically, it really fine tunes, it really calibrates and coordinates your salience landscaping. You're much less liable to bullshit yourself. So you start to see the real patterns in the world. And that's the thing. So in addition to inner peace, we want our inner peace to be caused by what's real, right? We want to be in contact with what's real. And so Plato's idea is you get the inner dialogue going, and that affords the outer dialogue. But then the outer dialogue with the world, where I am picking up on the real patterns, I internalize that. And that helps with the inner dialogue. And then the inner dialogue helps the outer dialogue. And that's what I mean earlier. What I was saying, we get the intrapersonal communication and communing working. So the extrapersonal, right, communing and communication work, and they have to be completely in sync with each other. And so I see all of that as a deeply, deeply dialogical process. It's dialogical this way, the anagoge, right? It's dialogical that way. And the relationship between them in anagoge is dialogical.
So I was thinking about the brain, right? The two hemispheres of the brain. I was thinking about the fact that we know that crawling improves the ability of the two hemispheres of the brain to communicate to each other.
I totally think so. I totally think so.
I don't think a lot of research has been done on climbing, but I suspect that it has very profound impacts on the ability of the aspects of the self to integrate. And that's a lot of what is sort of coming up for me here is that so we have this potential for differentiation and this potential for sort of unification of that differentiation. And we see this with motor processing, that essentially as an athlete becomes better, they're able to actually have their body essentially have more pieces, more pixels, but be able to unite those pixels better within patterns.
Totally. I totally see that.
And that if we're back to this idea of like, well, you were talking about like, is this about just getting the right ontology? Right. And one other sort of dichotomy or dualism that has been popping into my head as we've been talking is the idea of being and becoming, right?
Yep.
It's like in some way parallel to the idea of, the forms versus the reality.
Plato, totally, yep.
Yeah. So in some sense, this is what it feels like to me, is that in some sense, the quest to get the narrative right or to get the ontology right is kind of a quest to get the ground of being set correctly. And that's important, but it's incomplete, because how we experience being is always as a process of becoming. And if we don't have processes in dialogue and in physical practice that allow us to engage in becoming, then any model of being can actually become sort of tyrannical and stagnant.
Oh, totally. And I think this goes back to, the language of, and this is Platonic, right? And this is something I'm critical of Plato, right? not only am I critical of the whole antibody thing, I'm also critical of the priority of being over becoming, of Parmenides over Heraclitus, right? So I think what you're saying, and it has both, it goes this way with existential import and it goes this way with ontological import, is, emanation is basically being. It is the eternal aspects of things. It is like the laws, right? And emergence is the becoming. But as I've been arguing throughout, they are completely interdependent and interdefining. I don't like the axial two worlds way of trying to deal with this. So for all of my deep love of Plato, and it's profound, I don't like the way he separates, right? Here's the world of being, and here's the world of becoming, and this is the illusory world, and this is the real world. I think that's a fundamental mistake. And I think the recovery of the body is a recovery of the realization that those two are completely interpenetrating.
This is maybe a little bit of a tangent, and I do have to go pretty soon because I have a meeting here in 5 minutes. But I wanted to throw this at you because I think it's interesting. Christianity, right? We talked about earlier the idea that Christianity sort of also sort of renounces the body.
Not initially, because it has the incarnation, right?
And that's the thing that I wanted to bring up. Like one of my employees is a very devout Christian. It comes from he went to school at Oral Roberts, and he's very, very insistent on the idea that what Christ is talking about is the physical resurrection of everybody, right? That the spirit is not separable from the physical, and so this original Christianity has this aspect of bringing the body back into the conversation.
Totally.
And yet somehow it seems to continue to get lost throughout the history of Christianity.
Well, and part of that is, and this is where I want to be critical. I mean, that's kind of Neoplatonism's fault. And so for all of the way in which I think Neoplatonism is really valuable, important, and really lifted Christianity up into something, I think Neoplatonism, Porphyry begins Plotinus's biography by saying, Plotinus always behaved like someone who was ashamed of having a body. That's the first line of Plotinus's biography. It's like, it's like, then that whole aspect, and I think it was a fundamental confusion. I think they were trying to talk about modal confusion between the having mode and the being mode, or the becoming mode. Maybe we should call it the being becoming mode. But anyways, I think, and then they got caught up in the body, and then of course Augustine made it worse with his sex addiction, right? Mm-hmm. But Aquinas actually criticizes Augustine, and he says, "Well, like, what's the point of the resurrection if we can be disembodied spirits floating around with God? Like, why are we dragging these bodies around?" Because he was an Aristotelian, he thought that you couldn't have. Then that was Aristotle's great critique too, right, of Plato, is you shouldn't be trying to separate the two together. But you see, even Aristotle gives priority to the form over the matter. He gives priority to the emanation over the emergence. He's still a Platonist in that sense. I want to get past that. We should stop trying to prioritize either one of them.
I like the idea of the left and right, because I think there's an inherent psychological prioritization of up over down.
Yeah.
If we think as emanation and emergence this way, then that will automatically sort of place emanation as the superior of the two. Of course, we even have left and right, right? If we put something on the left, it is
sinister, and right-handed is dexter. But that's what I was trying to use the stereoscopic vision metaphor, right? Of looking through the left and the right visual fields, right? So we can see something. So we get like the third dimension. But instead of it being just perceptual, not excluding the perceptual, it has to be perceptual and ontological depth perception, totally mutually reinforcing each other.
So we need to wrap up now, but this has been incredibly rich. I think this has been one of our richest dialogues. I think it's interesting because my own interest in fantasy fiction in the past, I have thought of as kind of or speculative fiction as somewhat whimsical, right? Somewhat lacking in profundity. And yet I feel like and I thought this conversation would be not necessarily as forwarding our overall dialogue as some of the other things that we talked about. I mean, it seems like it provided grounds for an extremely deep conversation. And I'm curious, I'm just curious to hear your comment on that before we wrap up. What is it about these stories that actually provides us? Why do we think that they're unserious? And yet, why do they have so much attraction? And why can they be the grounds of something like the dialogue we just had?
Yeah, I think they're, well, I mean, we've talked a lot about how they're trying to bridge between the past and the future. I see them as inherently trying to give us a stereoscopic vision that we've been talking about. And in that sense, I mean, people make this point about science fiction, which is really, I think, a really good point, that science fiction is unlike other fiction, in that speculative fiction, science fiction, the main character is the world, right? And it's where we're doing world building. And so I see it as what I think I've been arguing for here, which is I want to get past the nostalgia, right, for the mythopoetic world, and I want to get past the horror of the dystopic, rational, purely, well, truncated rational. I think the notion of rational is too small, but the rational empiricist world, right, the rational materialist world, because what I want to do is see through them to the possibility of world building, which is what I think you need, right, in order to make, right, narrative possible for us again. So I think why we are attracted to these stories is because they put us in touch with something that has always hovered between myth and science, which is cosmology, right? We're trying to build a cosmology, and that is, in some ways, something we've been talking about here from the very beginning. And I think we're in the very, in history, unique position that our cosmology it can't be just mythologically generated like they were in the past. And it can't just, our science doesn't seem to be capable of giving it to us. And we need something that puts us back into that space again. I think that's what science fiction does for us.
That's beautiful. There's something you said there that was really interesting to me. You said world building.
Yeah.
Right? And world building, I thought ontology as process.
Yes, as practice too. Like, so the point about world building is it's not the same as a worldview, right? Your the point of a cosmology is you can live in it, right? Right. That's what makes a huge difference. So that's what Campagna, the guy who wrote Technique and Magic, I'm just reading it right now. That's his preferred term, and I think that's right. And I talk about, like in the series, I talk about how we went from a cosmos to a universe, and right. But see how it lurks. What did Sagan name his series? He didn't name it universe. He named it cosmos because he wanted to somehow awaken in us a capacity to live in it in wonder and appreciation.
Yeah. Let's stop there. I think that's
Okay.
good.
Yeah.
How do we reawaken the capacity to live in the world with wonder and wonder? What was the other one? Wonder and imagination. Wonder and appreciation.
And I mean both senses of that word, right? Which is a profound valuing and a profound understanding.
Excellent. And we tell these stories because in some sense they can be powerful tools. Maybe we'll have another dialogue where we talk about how those tools are being misused in a lot of ways, because I don't think that a lot of what's coming out of Hollywood is really trying to utilize this medium to achieve what it perhaps was originally intended for.
No, it's often a horrible mongrel. We've got pre-axial Greek gods running around with post-axial, postmodern sensibilities, and like I said to Damien, like, my friend Leo Ferraro, the people, like, they can accept that Superman can fly and shoot out heat beams from his eyes, and they can also see X-ray vision, even though that's not how vision works at all. But the fact that he could be a moral agent, well, they just don't buy that. That's why they like Batman. It's like, where did you get to where, it's okay that he flies and he has heat vision, but he can't be a moral agent for you. Like what?
Yeah. There's something that's happened within science fiction and fantasy fiction, in my experience, where it's become incredibly cynical.
Yeah.
And some of that art is great, but the fact that it's all cynical and that not being cynical is sort of perfectly parallel with being low quality says something very interesting about the current cultural moment. I'm also interested in the way in which the current politics, and this particularly left-wing politics, are being transposed into our secondary worlds in very interesting ways. So we'll have to chat about it more. But for now, I really do have to go because I expect friends to be knocking on the door any moment now. But John, this was wonderful. It's always so good to talk to you. And
I enjoyed this thoroughly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be great to at some point send a link to this to Damien so he could take a look at it too. This was truly wonderful. I really enjoyed this a lot. I wouldn't mind putting this up on my channel at some point too.
Yeah, let's do it. And I'd love to hear how you go with the Second Apocalypse series. I'd love to have a dialogue with that if you're able to get through reading. I know you're a very busy. You get a chance to be on.
But I like that. I like that the way you explained that. I thought that was really, really attractive. Really, the way he's got the two horrors. It reminds me of how Buddhism tries to get you, exposes you to the horror of mortality and then the horror of immortality. So that only in experiencing both horrors can you come to really live. So it reminds me exactly of that.
That's great. Okay, I gotta go.
Take care, my friend.
Love you, man. Talk soon.
Love you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. If you want to support what we're doing, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notifications button so you know what's coming up. And of course, the biggest support you can give is to become a Patreon supporter. This is what's going to allow us to grow this platform more than anything else. So this is entirely listener supported, and we really appreciate your support. And we look forward to talking to you again soon.